Did you know that one day, the entire galaxy looked at Earth and laughed, with such immense disdain that it seemed impossible for humans to offer anything beyond a sack of weaknesses? But what happened when the mighty galactic empires, with their technological ships and fearsome armies, challenged humanity? Get ready for a twist that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about power, war, and resistance. Imagine a galaxy ruled by vast empires, with the Rivik coalition at the top, dominating everything with their advanced weaponry and lethal strategies. Now imagine that a single human ship, which looked more like a relic from a distant past, dared to challenge their supremacy. What some considered a joke soon became a galactic nightmare for others. A story where, for the first time, the greatest empire in the galaxy was defeated by a species that still used iron and cannons. Sounds impossible, right? But that's exactly what happened. In this episode, we'll reveal how humanity not only survived but turned the tables in a way no one ever predicted. The day humans forever changed the tide of galactic war, forcing Rivik, once absolutely supreme, to surrender before human brutality. And the best part? They didn't use the most advanced weapons, nor energy shields, but rather a philosophy of resistance that brought an iron empire to its knees. Want to know how? Keep following along to understand the power of human resilience and the rise of a new order in the cosmos. It was a quiet morning in the central sector of the galaxy, but the Rivik coalition, known for its undisputed supremacy, did not afford itself moments of peace. Every new day, its cruisers sliced through the stellar skies with precision and power. Their ships were a spectacle of advanced engineering, fast, razor-sharp, and equipped with the deadliest plasma weaponry. A concentrated energy beam capable of reducing any invader to dust. Impenetrable energy shields, advanced enough to make any civilization bow before their might. If a rival force dared to approach, Rivik simply erased them from existence. No warrior outside the coalition knew what it was to resist a direct attack from them. Until one day, something unexpected happened. Rivik, with its self-sufficiency ingrained in its military culture, never imagined it could be challenged, much less by a species it considered primitive. Humans. They were entering Rivik territory. But Rivik was unfazed. After all, what could a human ship possibly do against a war machine of their fleet's magnitude? Commander Vash, his gaze as sharp as a predator's, scoffed at the situation. The Invictus, the human ship crossing the Rivik border, looked more like a rusted piece of scrap metal, an ugly anomaly amidst Rivik perfection. He laughed, and with him, his subordinates. How could they take a warship seriously when it looked like a heap of junk? Impossible. Commander Vash and his lieutenant Reek, their faces sculpted in contempt, discussed how outdated the ship seemed. Physical projectiles? They still use that? Reek sneered, observing the Invictus with a cutting laugh. These humans don't even understand the basics of what a war cruiser is. Our plasma technology could vaporize them in a second. But while Rivik laughed, the truth that was about to be revealed would be far more terrifying than any joke or underestimation. It wasn't the Invictus that was out of place. It was Rivik itself, about to learn a painful lesson. With their plasma cannons locked on target, Vash was ready to fire a warning shot. A beam so concentrated it could turn a Rivik cruiser into a ball of fire in the vacuum of space. "Fire!" he ordered, with the confidence of someone who knew victory was certain. The plasma beam launched toward the human ship. Tension spread through the Rivik war station, their hopes high. But when the beam collided with the Invictus's hull, something inexplicable happened. There was no explosion, not even a scratch. The plasma simply vanished, without a trace. Silence filled the room, and the confidence that once adorned Rivik faces was replaced by growing doubt. Vash stared at the monitor, eyes wide. "Impossible," he murmured, his words a whisper of disbelief. "What just happened?" Reek, visibly shaken, tried to make sense of it, but the explanations were beyond his understanding. The energy from the plasma beam had simply been absorbed. The human ship had not only withstood the impact, it had consumed it, as if it were nothing. A cold shock spread among the Rivik officers as their fingers frantically danced over the controls to launch another salvo. "Fire everything you can! Break that ship!" Vash shouted. But what would happen next would change everything for the Rivik. Each shot, more devastating than the last, was fired in a final effort to destroy the threat. Yet, like the first, the plasma beams simply vanished upon colliding with the hull of the Invictus. The situation was spiraling out of control. The laughter had given way to silent panic. The Rivik, who saw themselves as masters of the universe, began to wonder if they had finally encountered something greater than their supremacy, something that even the most advanced technology could not defeat. A sense of apprehension took hold of them. The human ship, once ridiculed, was now challenging everything the Rivik knew about war and power. They were facing a situation they had never encountered before. Fear. The fear of something they could not understand. How could anyone absorb such power? How could someone survive so many attacks without even showing signs of weakness? When Commander Vash finally gave the order to fire a particle beam, a weapon capable of tearing a planet to pieces, he had no idea what he was truly up against. But the shot was fired, and what happened next changed the game entirely. The particle beam, with all its power and intensity, was also absorbed by the Invictus. And for the first time, the Rivik began to question whether they had underestimated the most dangerous enemy they had ever encountered. Their strategy no longer worked. The first seeds of panic began to take root. How could they be defeated if their supremacy was unquestionable? What did the humans have that they didn't understand? What else could the Invictus be hiding? And, above all, what were the humans about to do? In the Rivik war room, the officers exchanged glances, words dragging in a muffled silence. What once seemed like a joke was now turning into a nightmare. And Commander Vash, with Rivik pride in ruins, knew something was about to happen. But what? Doubt hung in the air, and the next move could be the end of their supremacy. Commander Vash, his expression still hardened by disbelief, refused to accept what was happening. How could a plasma beam, capable of vaporizing even the most resistant ships, simply vanish, disappearing into the vastness of space? The frustration was palpable, but he could not show weakness. Just another miscalculation. It could have been an anomaly, he said, trying to dismiss the growing feeling that something was terribly wrong. But in his mind, one question persisted. Who were these humans? And how had they achieved a level of resistance that defied all the laws of physics and warfare? The Rivik had always held superiority, but now it felt like the universe was working against them. Reek, who had once seemed confident and invincible, now looked visibly shaken. He studied the monitors with growing obsession, trying to find the flaws in his analysis, the gaps in logic. But what his sensors showed was even more disturbing. Nothing made sense. No logical explanation could decipher the resilience of the human ship. "This isn't possible," he murmured, his voice trembling. "There is no material or technology that absorbs plasma beams like this." Deep down, something was beginning to take shape in his mind. What the humans were using was not something external. It was a mindset, a philosophy of war. And that philosophy defied everything the Rivik believed about power and domination. Vash watched Reek, his eyes narrowing in disdain, trying to mask the growing sense of despair. Fire again, and prepare the ultimate weapon, a particle beam. This will put an end to this joke," he commanded with rising fury. The Rivik had this trump card, a particle weapon so powerful it could pierce through a planet's layers of rock and melt its crust. This was the key to their supremacy. A direct burst of subatomic particles, an unstoppable force of destruction. Vash knew this would be the final blow, the one that would shatter the humans' resistance once and for all. But what happened when the beam was fired? No one was prepared for it. The particle beam launched with all its destructive force toward the Invictus. Space around the human ship vibrated with the intensity of the attack. Vash watched the screen with eagle-eyed focus, anticipating the moment of impact. The moment he would see the great human ship obliterated in a burst of energy. But none of that happened. The particle beam touched the Invictus's hull, and it was as if it had collided with an invisible barrier. He disintegrated, as if his very energy had been absorbed by something beyond comprehension. Silence took over the room. There were no explosions, no destruction. The particle beam, one of Rivik's greatest advancements, had simply vanished. Reality was becoming unbearable for the Rivik. Reek, his eyes fixed on the monitors, was still trying to believe what was happening. He mumbled incoherent words, searching for a logical, scientific explanation, anything that could justify what he was seeing. This is impossible, he murmured. But Vash, who had remained in control until now, finally allowed himself to show what he was feeling, a mixture of fury and despair. Fire again, now! But terror was already taking root in the depths of their minds. Rivik was not dealing with just any ship. They were facing a technology, a philosophy, a power that transcended everything they had ever known. Confidence, the foundation of their supremacy, was rapidly slipping away. And then, in the silence that followed, something even stranger happened. The station's sensors detected a change in Invictus's systems. Something was preparing. Something was about to happen. And then, Vash saw it. The Invictus began to rotate, positioning itself strategically, as if it were preparing for something the Rivik could not understand. In a maneuver that would have been impossible for any other ship, the Invictus was getting ready to attack. Commander Vash, who had been on the verge of ordering a retreat, was now in panic. He had never imagined he would one day feel fear in the presence of a race he considered inferior. But in the face of that human ship, he did. He felt defeat approaching, slow, inevitable. The worst part was the doubt. Until that moment, the Rivik had always known what to do, had always had an answer. They had power, technology, and a formidable army. But now, they were being surpassed by something they couldn't quantify. The humans, with their antiquated-looking ships and seemingly rudimentary weapons, were challenging the natural order of things. How was it possible? It was as if the very galaxy was rewriting its rules. The Rivik were no longer playing a game they controlled. Now they were mere spectators, powerless, waiting to see what would come next. And what would come next was something that would change the galaxy forever. The truth began to reveal itself slowly, like a layer of ice cracking under the heat of the sun. The Rivik had never faced a threat like this before. Human technology, so simple at first glance, was revealing a complexity of resilience that defied all logic of galactic warfare. These were not energy shields, like the Rivik used on their ships, but something far more solid and fundamental: heavy, resistant metal armor, layer upon layer of reinforced metal, built to withstand brutal attacks and resist the enemy. Every part of the Invictus seemed designed to endure the unthinkable, and the impact of each shot that struck it was absorbed in an unbelievable manner. Rivik's sensors began picking up details about the Invictus that they couldn't process. The hull of the human ship not only withstood the attacks but seemed to incorporate the energy from the beams, converting the power of the assaults into an even greater form of resistance. Invictus's energy absorption technology was something no Rivik intelligence could have predicted. The Rivik had always considered energy shields the only viable method of defense, but what the humans were using defied that premise. The Invictus didn't need shields. It simply swallowed the energy and kept moving forward, unstoppable, as if it were destined for victory. The philosophy behind this approach was what disturbed the Rivik the most. They had been taught to believe that speed, sophistication, and agility were the pillars of power. If the shields fell, the ship would be destroyed, simple and direct. But humans didn't play by Rivik's rules. Their strategy was different. If you have a shield and it fails, you're dead. But if you have enough armor to absorb everything, then you just keep fighting, one of the Rivik officers reflected, eyes wide. It wasn't about avoiding attacks. It was about enduring them. Enduring until the last breath, until the enemy grew tired of fighting. As the Rivik tried to understand Invictus's energy absorption mechanics, another reality imposed itself upon them. It wasn't just about a ship. It was about a much greater human philosophy. A philosophy reflected not only in the construction of their ships, but in their very approach to war. Where the Rivik saw war as a game of speed and rapid attacks, humans saw it as a test of endurance. Where the Rivik relied on immediate devastation, humans relied on perseverance and willpower. They were made of pure resilience. This difference in mentality was beginning to affect Rivik officers psychologically. The Invictus, once considered a joke, now seemed invincible. Every attack launched against it failed. Every plasma shot, every particle beam, every strike attempted by the Rivik simply disappeared upon hitting the hull of the human ship. It was a new sensation for the Rivik. They were not used to being powerless against an enemy. Even more so, they were not used to seeing an enemy that simply would not fall. They were beginning to realize that by underestimating the humans, they had ignored their true strength. Vash, once an arrogant and confident commander, began to feel the weight of doubt. He knew the Rivik had always been unbeatable. They had faced countless threats, destroyed entire empires, and subjugated civilizations that dared to challenge them. But now, they were up against something different, something they could not control, something they could not understand. The fear that had always been reserved for their enemies was now settling into the very war room of the Rivik. And the worst part was knowing that this sense of helplessness was spreading throughout the fleet. They could do nothing against the Invictus, and that was when a new idea emerged. This was not a matter of military power. It was a matter of evolution. Humans, with all their seemingly outdated technology, had reached a level of resilience and adaptation that the Rivik could not have predicted. Without realizing it, they were dominating the war not through the destruction of their enemies, but through their sheer ability to survive, to adapt, and to fight until the very last moment. The Rivik began to understand that perhaps humans were not just a primitive race, but a race on the rise, one that knew how to turn every challenge into an opportunity. And as unsettling as that was, there was something else that could not be ignored. The humans were beginning to turn the tide in their favor. The Rivik had never found themselves in a vulnerable position. Their power was absolute. The terror their fleet instilled in other systems was indescribable. But now, in that moment, something was happening that they did not know how to face. Commander Vash, under immense pressure, had no more commands to give. Only the growing realization that victory, once guaranteed, was slowly slipping from his grasp. The Rivik began to understand that they had been deceived. They had underestimated humanity, and now they were confronted with something they could not control: the unknown. The particle beam, the Rivik's ultimate weapon of destruction, had been fired with the intent to end everything. With each passing second, the power emanating from this weapon, a weapon capable of tearing a planet in half, was indescribable. But when the particle beam struck the hull of the Invictus, the feeling was different. There was no explosion, no tremor in space, nothing. The impact was absorbed by the human ship as if it were made of a substance that ignored the laws of physics. And in that moment, terror took hold of the Rivik crew. They could not comprehend it. They could not accept it. Vash, who had always believed in the unquestionable power of the Rivik, now stood in utter shock. His fingers trembled as he struggled to understand what was happening. There was no denying it anymore. The Rivik were being defeated. The terror that spread through the war room was palpable. Even the most experienced officers did not know how to react. They were face to face with something they could not destroy, something they could not even scratch, something that made their advanced weaponry look like mere toys. Fear gripped their hearts. Reek, Vash's most trusted lieutenant, looked at the commander with wide eyes. The expression on his face was no longer one of confidence, but of confusion and dread. "Commander," he said, his voice unsteady, "we need to reconsider our strategy." He had never spoken like that before. Reek, the lieutenant who had always shown unwavering confidence, was now displaying clear signs of weakness, and that made Vash realize that this was real. They were losing. They were being outmatched by a race they had considered primitive. Reality was crushing the Rivik's arrogance. With the Invictus's weapon systems now activated, the Rivik war room fell into absolute silence. No sound, no movement, nothing. but the waiting. And the tension was rising, growing to an almost unbearable level. The human ship, which until now had been the target of jokes, was about to strike back. There were no more doubts. What the Rivik were about to experience was something they had never felt before, the sensation of vulnerability. And what would come next would be Rivik's worst nightmare. Vash clenched his fists, trying to focus, but the truth was inescapable. The Invictus was no longer a simple threat. It was a monster awakening, a beast ready to attack. The commander looked at the monitors and saw the launch tubes activating. They weren't plasma cannons. They weren't particle beams. It was something much simpler and, at the same time, far more devastating. What was about to happen was something the Rivik could never have imagined. Something that would bring true retaliation upon them. Something they could not stop. As the Invictus prepared to launch its projectiles, Reek finally understood what was happening. That's not just a projectile. It's an asteroid catapult. He was right. What the Rivik were about to face was no longer advanced technology, but a primal war. A simple piece of metal, propelled by a gravitational field. And despite its apparent simplicity, it was the key to total destruction. Plasma, beams, particle weapons, energy shields, all of it now seemed irrelevant. The real power lay in the simplicity of brute force, and humans knew how to wield it like no one else. The asteroid catapult fired with such force that even the Rivik systems trembled. The projectile traveled through the vastness of space at an astonishing speed, seemingly disregarding the laws of physics. The Rivik, with their powerful fleet, were used to fighting enemies with the most sophisticated technology. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared them for this. As the metal projectile approached the Rivik station, the officers began to realize this was no ordinary attack. There was no plasma, no particles, only raw force. And yet, it had the power to destroy everything. The impact was devastating. The energy shield protecting the Rivik station collapsed instantly, as if it were made of paper. The sheer force of the impact completely shattered the station's defenses, and security systems began failing one by one. The station's hull was pierced with terrifying ease, cracking like glass as internal systems collapsed. The sound of destruction, though muffled by the vacuum of space, was almost deafening. The Rivik were being destroyed not by technological advancements, but by the sheer brutality of a piece of metal. The second projectile was fired almost immediately, its trajectory precise and relentless. The Rivik scrambled to regroup, desperately trying to reactivate their shields, but it was too late. The next impact struck the core of the station, the AR, source of its power, its beating heart. When the core was hit, the shockwave that spread through the station was immense. The Rivik, once seemingly invincible, were now at the mercy of a simple yet deadly attack. The surrounding Rivik ships began moving in panic, attempting to escape the inevitable destruction. But the truth was, there was no escape. They were being crushed by the force of human vengeance. In the station's war room, the officers were in complete despair. Screens flickered, and systems began shutting down one by one. Commander Vash, who had once taken pride in his supremacy, was now utterly lost. "This isn't possible," he whispered to himself, watching the explosions rip through his fleet. "They can't do this." But he knew there was nothing left to do. The Rivik resistance was disintegrating before his eyes, and the worst part was that they weren't facing a force that could be defeated with more plasma or particle beams. They were being destroyed by a mindset, a human mindset. When the final impact struck the Rivik station, the destruction was absolute. The once proud and imposing structure was now in ruins. The energy shields had collapsed, the Rivik flagship was unrecognizable, and the station's very core was disintegrating. The power of a simple kinetic attack had turned the tide of war, and the Rivik were on the brink of total defeat. None of the Rivik officers had even imagined that something so simple, so primitive, could shatter their supremacy. As the Rivik fell, the Invictus made no move. The human ship did not advance to destroy the survivors. It simply remained there, motionless in space, a silent warning to any civilization that dared to challenge humanity. The Rivik, who had dominated the galaxy for so long, now found themselves at the mercy of a race that seemed to understand the concepts of war and power in a completely different way. The humans had not won through sheer brute force or advanced technology. They had won because, in the end, they understood a truth that the Rivik had ignored. Power lies not only in attack, but in the ability to endure. And so, the Rivik, one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy, was forced to watch as their fleet disintegrated, their systems shut down, and their dreams of supremacy faded away. Earth's true revenge was not in immediate destruction, but in relentless resistance. The unwavering belief that if they just kept fighting, if they held on long enough, victory would come. And for the Rivik, that was death. The death of an idea, the death of an empire. But more importantly, it was the birth of a new order, and that order was human. The Rivik had never imagined they would see the day when their supremacy was questioned. How could they? After all, how could such a young, disregarded race manage to stand against something as unstoppable as the might of the Rivik coalition? Rivik pride was something tangible, deeply ingrained in every officer, every soldier, every commander. But now, amidst the wreckage of their fleet, the pride of Vash and his entire crew was crumbling, just like the ships floating in shattered pieces around them. Defeat, which had once seemed so distant and impossible, had become a brutal reality. And the feeling consuming each of the Rivik was not just fear. It was a profound humiliation, something even their worst nightmares could not have foreseen. Commander Vash, who had always relied on his unbeatable strategy and the metallic armor of his ships, was now paralyzed. He stared at the monitors, eyes glazed over, unable to believe what was unfolding before him. The Rivik were losing, and losing to humans, a race they had considered inferior, was something that burned in his soul. No, we can't lose to them, Vash thought, the words dragging through his mind. But the truth was inescapable. The Rivik fleet, in its immense arrogance, had been defeated not by numbers, but by human strategy. The silent brutality of human resistance was winning, and that was what hurt the most. The Rivik officers looked at each other, their faces blank, unsure of what to do. The defeat was absolute. The Rivik shield had fallen, and there was no way to keep fighting. No way to face an enemy that would not yield, that would not surrender. These were no longer the primitive humans the Rivik had once underestimated. They were masters of war, capable of withstanding any attack and, more importantly, capable of turning every mistake into an opportunity for victory. The philosophy they had ignored, that war is not won by strength alone, but by the ability to endure, was now destroying the Rivik. Commander Vash, with a bitter knot in his throat, knew that for the first time, he was no longer in control. "Commander?" A subordinate's murmur broke the silence, their voice heavy with an overwhelming sense of inevitable defeat. "We need to retreat. If we don't, the Rivik will be extinct." It was the kind of sentence that would never have been spoken aloud within the walls of a Rivik war room. But now it was being said with an unsettling ease. Vash turned to his subordinate, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and shame. He knew that human resistance had shattered his confidence. And more importantly, he knew that now there was only one option: surrender. But Vash's pride would not allow him to yield so easily. His mind was torn between the responsibility of saving what remained of the Rivik and the pain of accepting defeat. He didn't want to surrender. He didn't want to send the retreat signal. But the idea of continuing the fight only to be completely annihilated was even more unbearable. What the humans had demonstrated was not just resilience. It was proof that the Rivik, despite all their supremacy, were obsolete. They could no longer stand against human endurance. The Rivik, who had once subjugated so many civilizations, now found themselves forced to kneel before a race that knew how to fight to their last breath. Vash finally gave the order, his voice lower than he had ever imagined it could be. "Send the retreat signal," he said, each word leaving his lips like a crushing weight. The Rivik were retreating. The empire that had ruled countless systems was, for the first time, surrendering to an enemy. The once imposing Rivik ships now began to pull away, their war sails retracting in a humiliating withdrawal. And as the fleet fled, the Invictus remained exactly where it was, silent, unyielding. It would not pursue them. It didn't need to. It already knew that victory was assured. It had already shown the universe who the real predator was. And so, the Rivik, who believed themselves to be the greatest force in the galaxy, watched their fleet disappear into the void of space in a desperate retreat. For the first time, the Rivik had lost control. Their great supremacy had been shattered. And what humanity had proven, relentlessly, was simple. Human resilience and determination could surpass even the most powerful forces in the galaxy, the Rai. Rivik Empire had fallen, and with it, an entire chapter of galactic history. But what remained now was the beginning of something new, something far more dangerous for everyone else. Vash closed his eyes, trying to process what had happened. The Rivik, so certain of their invincibility, were now a mere shadow of themselves. He knew that history books would never tell of such a defeat. How could they? The Rivik, who had once conquered entire worlds, now found themselves relegated to the role of the vanquished. He couldn't understand it, couldn't accept it. How could such a young, underestimated race defeat something so absolute, so powerful? He felt the weight of shame, and even more, the crushing sense of helplessness that consumed him. The galaxy would never be the same again. And he knew the Rivik would never be the same again. Reek, always by Vash's side, was now silent, as if words had simply run dry. He looked at the commander, and a glance of understanding and despair passed between them. They had been defeated, and not just in any way, not in a conventional battle, where numbers and technology prevailed. No, they had been defeated by human strategy and resilience. And that was what terrified them the most. The Rivik had always believed that power lay in sheer strength, in instant destruction. But the humans had proven that true power lay in the ability to endure, to persist, to never give in, and that made them immortal. In the vastness of space, the Invictus remained unchanged, a silent yet imposing presence. The Rivik, with their ships destroyed and their hopes shattered, knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Humanity was no longer an inferior race, a species to be manipulated or subjugated. They had shown the universe that if there was a force to be respected, it was not the Rivik, nor any other so-called great civilization. It was humanity, a race that had learned to evolve, to adapt, and to endure in ways no one could have imagined. They had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the galaxy was now under new rule, the rule of humanity. In his final moments of reflection, Commander Vash couldn't help but think of something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We laughed at them," he murmured, his voice heavy with deep sorrow. Reek looked at him, his gaze empty, as if he knew that his commander's words were the only truth he could accept. "Yes," he replied, "but they never laughed back. They just waited and showed us who they truly are." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with mutual understanding. They had underestimated the humans, and now they were paying the price. In Vash's mind, a new thought began to take shape, one he had never considered before. Perhaps it was time to see humanity in a different light. Perhaps they were not the monsters he had imagined. Perhaps, in truth, they were something more, something far more powerful. They had shown the true nature of war, not with fire and destruction, but with resilience, with willpower, and with a strategy that defied all expectations. They did not need advanced weaponry to win. They only needed a cause worth fighting for. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered. And so, as the stars continued to shine in the vast ocean of the universe, the Rivik retreated from the center of galactic power, while humanity took its first steps as a force to be reckoned with. The galaxy, once dominated by fear and the ruthless brutality of empires, now felt the weight of a new order. The humans had shown everyone that true power did not come from destroying one's enemies, but from never giving up, from fighting to the very end, and when necessary, taking a step back only to return even stronger. They had turned the tide of the galactic war, and now, without exception, everyone would have to live with it. A new era had begun, and the Rivik, now in retreat, knew that humanity was a real threat. But more than that, they were the future, and the Rivik, who had always thought themselves the masters of the galaxy, now saw the truth with absolute clarity. Humanity's rise was only just beginning. What the Rivik had failed to understand was simple. The fate of the galaxy was never decided by the strength of a civilization. It was decided by the willpower of a race, and that race was human. The galaxy will never be the same after humans change the course of the war, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The rise of humanity, the unstoppable force of resistance, and the game-changing strategy. All of this proves that power doesn't come from the most advanced technology, but from something much deeper, the will to fight until the end. But will other galactic empires learn the lesson? Or does humanity still have much more to show? Don't miss the next story, where the surprises continue, and you'll find out whether humanity can finally dominate the cosmos, or if an even more dangerous challenge will emerge. Now, tell me, do you think other civilizations will try to challenge the humans? How do you imagine the future of galactic warfare? Leave your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any details of this incredible journey. The future of the galaxy is just beginning, and it is human.